The dust of the high plains settled on everything, a fine, ochre shroud over a silent world. It clung to the weathered boards of the isolated farmhouse, to the thirsty leaves of the cottonwood, to the brim of the hat on the man who stood on the porch, watching the horizon. Elias was a man carved from the landscape, all hard lines and quiet endurance. His heart a locked room since Sarah had been laid to rest on the hill overlooking the creek. He held a chipped ceramic mug, the coffee within it long since gone cold, his knuckles white around the handle. Before him, the dirt road that was his only tether to the world had delivered a specter. A woman walking. She moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if measuring the miles left in her soul. When she reached his fence line, she stopped, her hands clasped before her. Her face smudged with dirt and fatigue, but her posture unbent. There was a pride in her stillness that defied her circumstance. Elias descended the steps, the wood groaning under his weight. He stopped a few feet from her, the fence between them. He saw the frayed hem of her dress, the worn leather of her shoes. He saw the exhaustion in the deep shadows beneath her eyes, but in their depths, a flicker of something resilient, something unbreakable. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the immense quiet. "You lost." Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, met his. She gave a single, small shake of her head. He waited for her to speak, but she remained silent, a statue of weary dignity. He gestured vaguely toward the vast, empty land stretching behind her. "Nothing out here for miles," she offered no explanation. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the house, where a small face, his 5-year-old daughter Lily, had appeared in the window, a pale moon in the dusty glass. Then her eyes moved to the barn, and to the fields beyond, taking in the state of a place run by one man trying to do the work of 3. Finally, she looked back at him, her expression direct, questioning. A help-wanted notice, tear-stained and curling at the edges, was still pinned to the board in the general store. He hadn't expected an answer. "Not like this." "Can you work?" he asked, the words blunt. She nodded once. "Cook? Clean? Look after children?" Another nod, just as certain. He studied her, the suspicion warring with a desperation so profound it felt like a physical ache. The house was a mess of grief. The children were running wild, their laughter echoing in rooms that felt too empty. Caleb, his 8-year-old, was growing as thorny and defensive as the wild roses choking the fence. Elias was drowning, slowly, in the tide of his daily life. "You don't talk much," he stated, a question disguised as an observation. She simply held his gaze. Her silence was not empty. It was a wall, thick and high. He didn't know what was behind it, but he recognized the need for fortification. He had built walls of his own. He let out a long breath, the dust puffing from his lips. "The pay is board. A room of your own." Not much else to offer. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, a brief and startling glimpse of vulnerability. She gave a final, decisive nod. Elias unlatched the gate, the screech of the metal a kind of breaking seal. "Name's Elias. The young uns are Caleb and Lily." She stepped onto his land, her worn shoes making no sound in the soft dirt, and for the first time, she offered a gesture of her own, placing a hand over her heart and inclining her head. It was a promise, an oath delivered in the language of silence. He did not know her name, where she came from, or why silence was her only companion. He only knew the weight of his world had, for the first time in a year, felt infinitesimally lighter. The first days were a delicate, unspoken negotiation. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. She did not ask where things were. She found them. The scent of baking bread, a fragrance Elias hadn't realized he'd forgotten, began to fill the kitchen. The floors were scrubbed, the laundry folded, the chaos tamed into a gentle order. She moved around his grief as if she could see it, a tangible thing cluttering the rooms. She'd dust Sarah's rocking chair but never sit in it. She'd straighten the small, silver-framed photograph on the mantel but never linger on the smiling face within it. Lily, with a child's simple acceptance, was drawn to her silent gravity. She would follow the woman, chattering away, leaving small bouquets of dandelions on the table for her. The woman would smile, a small, slow curving of her lips, and place them in a jar of water. Caleb was another matter. He watched her with his father's suspicion, his arms perpetually crossed over his chest. "She's a strange one, Pa," he'd mutter at the barn, kicking at a loose stone. "Why doesn't she talk?" Elias had no answer. "She works hard," was all he would say. "That's what matters." He found her one afternoon, long after her chores were done, standing by the fence of the small, neglected kitchen garden. Sarah had loved that garden. It was a riot of weeds now, the soil cracked and dry. The woman stood with her back to him, her head bowed. He thought she might be crying, but when she turned, her face was serene. She looked at the fallow earth, then at him, an unmistakable question in her eyes. He gave a curt nod, turning away before she could see the memory that rose in him. Sarah, on her knees in that same patch of dirt, laughing as she held up a misshapen carrot. The next morning, the woman was there, on her knees, pulling weeds. Her hands, which he'd noticed were slender and looked as though they'd never known such labor, were soon stained with earth. She worked with a fierce, steady concentration, coaxing life from the abandoned plot. Elias watched her from a distance, mending a harness on the porch. He saw the way she measured the rows, the care with which she handled the old tools she'd found in the shed. She was not just weeding. She was tending. She was healing a small patch of his world. One evening, he came in from the fields, bone-weary and smelling of hay and sweat. The children were already asleep. A plate of food was waiting for him on the table, covered with a cloth. Beside it was a small bowl of wild strawberries, the first fruits of her foraging. And next to the bowl was an open book. It was one of Sarah's, a collection of poetry he hadn't seen in a year. It was open to a page he knew well, a poem about planting a garden as an act of faith. He looked up, toward the closed door of her small room. She wasn't just working in his house. She was reading its history, listening to its silence. She knew. He didn't know how, but he felt it with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. She knew about the crushing weight of his love for the woman buried on the hill, and she was honoring it. She was tending his grief as carefully as she was tending the garden. The summer deepened, ripening the plains to a golden brown. A rhythm established itself, as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. The clatter of pans in the morning, the hum of Lily's chatter, the solid thud of Caleb's boots on the porch, the shared silence around the dinner table. It was a silence that had changed its character. It was no longer an absence but a presence, a shared space of understanding. The garden flourished under the woman's patient hands. Green shoots of lettuce and beans pushed through the dark soil. The tomato vines, heavy with promise, climbed the stakes she had fashioned from fallen branches. The garden became a mirror for the house itself, a place where careful, quiet attention was bringing forth new life. Elias found himself speaking more, filling the silence not with idle talk, but with small offerings. "Creek's running high," he'd say, and she would nod, her eyes thoughtful. "Fox has been at the chickens again." And the next day he'd see she had reinforced the coop's latch. She never answered with words, but her actions were a clear reply. One sweltering afternoon, a storm rolled in fast and violent from the west. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind tore at the cottonwood. Elias was in the far pasture, trying to round up a spooked calf. As he ran toward the barn, a sharp crack of lightning lit the sky, followed by an immediate, deafening clap of thunder. He saw Caleb, who had been helping him, frozen in the middle of the yard, his face white with terror. Elias shouted his name, but the wind snatched the word away. Before he could move, the kitchen door flew open. The woman ran out, her skirts whipping around her legs. She didn't hesitate. She ran straight to Caleb, bent down, and wrapped her arms around him, shielding his head with her body as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. She held him, murmuring something Elias couldn't hear. A sound, not a word, a low, soothing hum. She guided the trembling boy back to the house, her hand firm on his shoulder. Later that evening, after the storm had passed and a watery sun painted the wet world in hues of silver and gold, Elias saw Caleb walk over to where the woman sat on the porch steps, mending one of Lily's dolls. The boy stood there for a long moment, shifting his weight. Then, he held out a small, perfectly round river stone he'd polished himself. "For you," he mumbled, not quite meeting her eyes. The woman looked at the stone in her palm, then up at Caleb. Her smile reached her eyes this time, transforming her face. She placed the stone carefully in her apron pocket, as if it were a precious jewel. Trust, Elias realized, was being planted, too. A few weeks later, Elias had to ride into town for supplies. It was a trip he dreaded, the forced pleasantries and the pitying looks of the townsfolk a heavy burden. As he was leaving the general store, his gaze fell upon a poster nailed to the wall. A wanted notice from a state farther east. It offered a reward for a man wanted for assault and robbery. Below his stern likeness was a smaller one, a grainy sketch of a woman listed as a person of interest, a witness who had fled. The name was different, but the eyes, even in the crude drawing, were unmistakably hers. They held the same haunted resilience. Elias stood frozen for a long moment, the sounds of the town fading away. The poster explained the silence, the fear, the reason a woman like her would appear from nowhere, seeking refuge in isolation. He felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his gut. Not at her, but for her. He imagined the life that had forced her into silence, into flight. Without a second thought, he reached up, tore the poster from the wall, crumpled it in his fist, and shoved it deep into his saddlebag. He would not be the man who returned her to that fear. He rode home under a vast, indifferent sky, the knowledge of her past settling beside his own grief. It was another secret the quiet house would now hold. That night, a terrible scream tore through the house. Elias was out of his bed in an instant, his heart pounding. It had come from her room. He stopped at her door, his hand raised to knock, but hesitated. He heard a choked sob, then silence. He stood there for a long time, the protector of a house full of sleeping children and wounded souls. He thought of the crumpled poster in his saddlebag. He thought of her running toward Caleb in the storm. He returned to his own room and found the old, worn shawl that had been Sarah's. It still held a faint scent of lavender. He walked back to her door and draped it carefully over the knob, a silent offering of comfort against the night terrors. In the morning, the shawl was gone. When the woman emerged from her room, her eyes were red-rimmed, but she wore the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked at him, and in her gaze was a deep, aching gratitude that needed no words. The seasons began to turn. The golden heat of summer gave way to the crisp, clear air of autumn. The garden yielded its bounty, and the woman canned and preserved, stocking the pantry shelves as if preparing for a long siege against the coming winter. One afternoon, Lily, who had been drawing with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood, looked up at the woman and asked the question that had hung in the air for months. "Why don't you ever talk?" she asked, her voice full of innocent curiosity. Caleb, sitting nearby, stopped whittling and looked up, waiting. Elias, mending a bridle on the porch, paused, his hands still. The woman looked at Lily, her expression unreadable. She set down the bowl of beans she was shelling. She gently touched Lily's cheek, then looked at Caleb. Her gaze was soft, but held a profound sorrow. She took a deep breath, as if drawing strength from the very air around her. Her lips parted. "Annalise," she said. Her voice was low and rusty, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years, but it was clear. It was a name. Her name. The children stared, speechless. Elias felt his own breath catch in his throat. "Annalise." She looked at Elias, a silent question in her eyes, asking if it was safe. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Later, when the children were in bed, they sat at the kitchen table. The lamp cast a warm, golden circle of light around them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The new silence was different, filled with the echo of her name. He was my husband, Annalise said finally, her voice still hesitant, fragile. The man on that poster. I saw it in your saddlebag. Elias didn't flinch. I was a teacher. He did not like the books. He did not like my voice. She folded her hands on the table. A tremor in them she could not hide. So I stopped using it. Silence was the only place he could not follow me. When I finally ran, I kept it. It had become my shield. Elias looked at her hands, then at her face, seeing not a victim, but a survivor of a war he could not imagine. He thought of his own silence, born not of fear, but of a loss so big it had stolen all his words. My wife, he began, his own voice thick with unshed emotion. Her name was Sarah. She loved this house. She loved that garden. She would have liked what you've done. You brought the life back. He finally said her name aloud to this stranger. This woman named Annalise, and the sound of it did not break him. It felt like an acknowledgement, a release. Annalise reached across the table and, for the first time, touched his hand. It was a brief, light touch, but it conveyed a universe of shared understanding, of grief seen and respected, of solitudes honored. He did not pull away. The next day, Elias led her up the small hill behind the house. They stood before the simple wooden cross that marked Sarah's grave. Wildflowers, planted by an unknown hand, bloomed at its base. I wanted you to see, he said quietly. Annalise stood beside him, her presence not an intrusion, but a quiet companionship. She was not replacing a memory. She was helping him carry it. They stood there as the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. Down below, the lights of the farmhouse flickered on. They could hear the faint sound of the children's laughter drifting up on the evening breeze. The house was no longer just a shelter from the plains. It was a home again, its quiet rooms filled with the sturdy, hopeful silence of a new beginning.